It looks like the end for Sergio Perez's F1 career after 14 years, unless he can somehow find a route back onto the grid for 2026. Perhaps when Cadillac-Ferrari arrives with 2 brand new seats on offer, Perez will remain with Daniel Ricciardo, Kevin Magnussen, Valtteri Bottas and Zhou Guanyu on F1's driver scrap heap. During his time in F1, Perez scored 6 Grand Prix victories, a respectable number, and finished runner-up in the 2023 Drivers' Championship. That's 2 victories fewer than Ricciardo and Ferrari's Charles Leclerc, 2 more than Carlos Sainz and Lando Norris, and 3 more than George Russell. There's probably a recency bias in the perception of Perez as the latest driver destroyed by Max Verstappen's brilliance. It's easy to forget, amid Perez's difficulties in making things work at Red Bull, that there were days when he delivered truly formidable world-class performances in his 4 years with the team. None more so than at Singapore in 2022, when he was absolutely masterful in containing Leclerc's Ferrari to win what was a very tricky race in mixed conditions. And as recently as last season, Perez genuinely outperformed Verstappen to win the 2023 Azerbaijan Grand Prix, withstanding immense pressure from Max after gaining the lead thanks to a fortunately timed pit stop behind the safety car. But those career highlights, to which we can also add his 2022 Monaco GP victory and an incredible pole position lap at Jeddah that same season, one of 3 he managed during his Red Bull stint, were quite obviously the exceptions to the rule. It's not uncommon for capable but fundamentally limited drivers like Perez to achieve modest success when presented with the right opportunity. But he's been badly exposed as Red Bull's rivals have become increasingly competitive over the past 18 months, with drivers who appear to fundamentally operate at a higher level than he can. That's ultimately why, despite originally offering Perez a new contract covering 2025 and 2026, Red Bull is now making yet another change to the non-Verstappen part of its driver lineup. And there have been clear signs, going right back to the earliest days of his F1 career, that Perez was probably always going to end up facing this difficult reality. Perez has had quite an unusual F1 career. He was 10 years into it by the time he took his first win in the pink Mercedes for Racing Point at the 2020 Sakhir Grand Prix. It was during his 7 seasons racing for the team formerly known as Force India that Perez made his reputation as a super solid point-scoring machine, a role which was perfectly suited to the sometimes challenging financial situation of the team for much of that period. He was the foundation upon which the team's famed bang-for-buck results were based. That Force India finished 4th in the 2016, 2017 and 2020 Constructors' Championships was based largely on Perez being the highest scorer behind those driving for F1's biggest teams. Perez entered F1 in 2011 as a Ferrari Academy driver placed at Sauber. He was paired there with Kamui Kobayashi. Checo would later say the Japanese driver taught him a lot about how to get the best from the delicate Pirelli tyres. The team's performance engineer was an ex-Michelin guy called Pierre Vacher, now Red Bull's technical director, and that too informed Perez's understanding. Perez's easy way with the tyres would go on to become a key strength of his game. His qualifying pace was rarely spectacular. He was quite closely matched to Kobayashi, a very capable midfield F1 driver who went on to become a sports car world champion and Le Mans 24 Hours winner with Toyota. Perez was notably good at Monaco and Singapore. Street circuits were already something of a speciality from his junior single-seater days. Even back then, he was noted as being a faster race day driver than qualifier. So these career traits, quick on street tracks, great at managing rear tyres, not a super quick qualifier, were already all in place. Still on the Ferrari Academy for 2012, Perez stayed with Sauber, which produced a car super easy on the tyres. With the very difficult Pirellis of that year, it occasionally allowed some spectacular race pace offsets, and Perez's skill set was perfect for taking full advantage. His thrilling chase of Fernando Alonso's Ferrari in Malaysia, finishing a strong second and looking briefly like he might win until sliding off the track in damp conditions, was a case in point. Another starring drive in Montreal was also rewarded with a podium, and there was his incredible charge to second at Monza, going around the outside of both Ferraris. It was this trio of starring drives that convinced McLaren to take a punt on Perez once it became clear Lewis Hamilton was going to quit the team to join Mercedes. The Sauber was a very good car on the tyres, but Perez was very good with them too, utilising his almost otherworldly sensitivity to how the rears would break traction under acceleration, so it was an occasionally sparkling combination. Again, he was no quicker than Kobayashi, but his 3 starring peaks were impressive enough to earn him his first shot in a top team. He'd also, by this time, gained a reputation for being very uncompromising in defence, a very tough guy to go wheel to wheel with. But it's also the case that Ferrari, monitoring Perez closely as part of its academy and becoming increasingly unconvinced by Felipe Massa's driving, had decided Perez wasn't worth hanging on to as a potential teammate for Alonso, and so perhaps therein lay a warning to other teams. Perez's McLaren stint lasted only one season. The 2013 car wasn't great. McLaren foolishly binned a design that finished the 2012 season as F1's strongest for an all-new design it felt was needed to properly challenge Red Bull in the final season of F1's V8 engine era. But even so, this was a season in which Perez was completely eclipsed by Jenson Button, a world champion, an incredibly reliable racer, but also a driver fundamentally limited in oversteering cars and proven to be slower than Hamilton over a single lap. The qualifying battle went marginally Perez's way, 10-9, but Button comprehensively outraced Perez and finished 2 places and 24 points clear of him in the championship. This was far from a vintage McLaren season, but there were also no signs of Perez being the sort of superstar driver that he'd just replaced. Perez was released at the end of the season and replaced by Kevin Magnussen. This was the moment of revelation as to what Perez's F1 career trajectory would most likely be, middling rather than stellar. He fell off the radar of the big teams and might well have ended up going to IndyCar at this point, but amid interest from the powerhouse Ganassi team, Perez landed another F1 seat at cash-strapped Force India, which had previously enjoyed a technical partnership with McLaren and developed a growing reputation for smoothing out the rough edges of young F1 drivers. Perez became an absolute pillar of that team over the next 7 seasons, and his ability to grind out the points was gold dust. He was also capable of springing a surprise big result when there was a good tyre day, and like at Sauber in 2012, this was a mid-grid team with an occasional tyre ace in its pocket. With ex-Bridgestone engineer Jun Matsuzaki, another guy Perez would work with very productively. Perez's 2014-16 teammate Nico Hülkenberg was initially faster and more successful, but Perez comfortably outscored him through 2015 and 2016, and his gentler style generally got more from the circumstances than the naturally more aggressive driving of Hülkenberg. Although the results were of a lower order than he'd later achieved with Red Bull, this was probably Perez's most effective and consistently impressive period as an F1 driver. But at the same time, there was probably also an element of Perez, a bit like with Daniel Ricciardo at Red Bull, being flattered by circumstance, particularly by how delicate the tyres were. This was something that endlessly frustrated Hülkenberg and sometimes contained his natural speed, so we didn't see the best of him as often as we should have done. When Perez then faced off against Mercedes junior Esteban Ocon, they were both remarkably close in pure performance, but Perez's consistency and experience helped him finish ahead in the points in both 2017 and 2018. The importance of Perez's substantial commercial backing from Mexico also helped cement his position as the main focus of a Force India team that depended on that money for its very survival, back when cost caps and equitable commercial revenue in F1 were still pipe dreams. As the team fell into receivership partway through 2018, Perez was instrumental in rescuing it from the claims of hostile creditors who wanted to wind up the operation. This action, in turn, facilitated a purchase of the team by Lawrence Stroll, who transformed it into the ambitious Aston Martin Works outfit we know today. Losing his drive at the end of 2020 to Ferrari outcast Sebastian Vettel was an unsentimental decision by Stroll that turned out to be a blessing in disguise for Perez, putting him on the market at just the moment Red Bull was looking for a reliable, experienced point scorer to partner Verstappen, someone good enough to take points off rivals and compromise their strategies, and to be there ready to win if Verstappen had a problem. Neither of the previous juniors, Alex Albon or Pierre Gasly, had been able to regularly perform this role, and Perez, coming off his best ever season in F1, winning the Sakir Grand Prix and beating Ricciardo, former Red Bull protégé Sainz and Red Bull's own man of the moment Albon in the standings, looked like the perfect emergency stopgap solution at a moment of self-inflicted crisis for Red Bull's junior driver programme. Perez joined Red Bull in the full belief he would be able to compete with Verstappen, regardless of the support role he'd actually been hired for. Ultimately, he couldn't compete with Verstappen, but initially he did perform well and played an important part in Verstappen's successful 2021 title bid, particularly by delaying Hamilton during a crucial phase of the Abu Dhabi finale. At his happy hunting ground of Baku, Perez scored his first victory for the team, there ready as backup when Verstappen retired from the lead with an exploding tyre. That win, as well as 4 other podiums and 4th in the World Championship, represented a very respectable start, but underlying this was a significant qualifying deficit of more than 0.4 of a second to Verstappen. Perez got to see, for perhaps the first time in his career, what the difference was between his own level and that of an F1 megastar. He was taken aback at how Verstappen could live with a super nervous rear end and then also use it to rotate the car into corners way faster than Perez could live with. But Perez is a tough, mentally resilient character, and he vowed to come back stronger for 2022. At the beginning of the season, before Red Bull got the excess weight off the car, the RB18 was an understeerer, so Verstappen hated it and Perez liked it. Suddenly, the gap between them was much smaller than it had been in 2021, and Perez, in what was F1's fastest car, regardless of its excess weight, began to have ideas of a title campaign. He'd been on course to win Jeddah, having set a resounding pole there, before a safety car appeared at just the wrong time for him. In hindsight, this was the strongest phase of Perez's Red Bull career, but in stepping out of his support role, he made himself unpopular with the Verstappen camp, especially when they suspected him of deliberately crashing in Monaco qualifying to prevent Max from beating his time. Perez nevertheless won that race, just as he'd signed a 2-year extension to his Red Bull contract. From the very next event in Baku, Red Bull's updates made the RB18 a much more Verstappen-like car, and Perez was left as far behind as he'd been in 2021, save for that magnificent drive to victory in Singapore, a world-class performance against Leclerc's Ferrari that was way beyond Perez's usual level. Perez's 2023 season followed a remarkably similar pattern, but with an even more dominant Red Bull. Fairly competitive with Verstappen in the early races, but falling way behind as the car developed to a place where Verstappen could squeeze more from it. In that early season phase, Perez took the Jeddah victory denied him in 2022, before then taking Verstappen on and beating him fair and square at Checo's special venue of Baku. An irritated Verstappen was reported by his father Jos as saying, "He's not going to do that to me again." And he didn't. In Miami, a couple of weeks later, even starting from 9th on the grid to Perez's pole, Verstappen was able to hunt him down, pass him and leave him far behind. That was the last time we saw a truly competitive Perez. His subsequent sequence of failures to make Q3, or sometimes even Q2, as Verstappen has dominated from the front, led to questions about how Red Bull would fare if Mercedes, Ferrari and McLaren, all with 2 super quick and competitive drivers, ever made competitive cars. For the second time in Perez's tenure there, Red Bull made serious attempts at convincing Norris to join as his replacement. Norris turned them down again, and the fears about other teams catching up finally came true in 2024. Perez was found wanting. Further off Verstappen's pace than ever before, he was the chief reason Red Bull was badly beaten to 3rd in the Constructors' Championship, a costly outcome. Perez has had a proud career as a multiple Grand Prix winner, a tough and tenacious competitor who has electrified F1's following in his home country of Mexico. On his good days, he was capable of taking on anyone, and if all the races on the calendar were held around Baku, he would surely be considered one of the all-time greats. But in the intensity of a close multi-team fight at the front, he wasn't quite able to justify his place at F1's top table.